The evolution of ethics from the pagans to the Christians and beyond. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. For those of you who have been following this, it was originally 4 parts, now 5 or 6, or who knows how many parts we're up to at this point. But we were doing a series on anthropology and ethics, and we've been marching through, originally we marched through the history of ideas from the perspective of what is man? How is it that a philosophy's understanding of man and his place within the cosmos affects things like worldview and ultimately ethics? And then we proceeded to backtrack and do a march through the various ethical systems that begin to evolve out of these anthropologies. And as tends to happen on this podcast, we ended up going long, and so we split the episode in 2. And so last time we marched through the fork in the road between, on the one hand, the materialists who ended up moving toward a form of hedonism on the one hand, and the providentialists on the other, those who believe that the world is ordered by something like a mind, and those who do not. And we saw the ways in which that belief that our world is ordered by something like a mind gave way to a worldview in which our world has objective, orderly structures. And of course, ethics then becomes an endeavor in understanding the nature of man, his place in the cosmos, and ultimately what it means for man to operate in accord with the order of nature. Today on the podcast, we're going to pick up with the Christians and how these various objective forms, these very providentialist views of ethics, begin to unfold into the Christian East and the West. By the way, this is a part 2, so there will be a lot of hearkening back to things talked about in the previous episode. So if you haven't listened to that, you might want to consider going back and listening to that first. But otherwise, we are going to jump in with the Christians and follow this through. Let's jump on in. So here, obviously, the Christians are going to be on the providentialist side of this ancient divide when it comes to reality and anthropology and ethics. And what you see actually a tremendous amount of resonance between pagan philosophy and their understanding of morality and what you find within the Christians, both East and West. So in general, one of the things that you find is you do find a continued advocacy of the concept of virtue. That is a centerpiece of Christian ethics, that the goal is to become virtuous, or at least that is part of the view of what it means to become a properly formed human being. In addition, what you begin to find is you find an advocacy of natural law. Now, later, in late medieval scholasticism, and we'll talk about this, there emerges the notion of divine command theory, which is an alternative to that, and that's really sort of birthed out of the nominalist movement. But since we're prior to that, we're going to sort of set that to one side until we get there. But by and large, what you find is you also find a concept of natural law, which is, again, advocated in the Christian East and in the Christian West. Now, there are definitely differences here, both between the Christian East and the Christian West on these matters, as well as between the Christians and the pagans. But let's just start with the differences between the Christians and the pagans. A couple of the differences that you begin to see when it comes to Christian-pagan divides. One of those is, of course, that there is, within Christianity, there is a greater concern for revelation. Now, I say greater concern because there's a certain, falsehood that circulates that, that philosophy deals in reason and religion deals in revelation, and that's why we have philosophy over here and we have religion over here. That is really, as I've talked about in other contexts, that is really an invention of modernity. You find that in people like Immanuel Kant, who want to say, religion deals with theology, the faculties of theology. They deal in ancient texts and ancient languages. That's what they do. And so everything when it comes to religion is about revelation, right? These purported revelatory texts. And then when you're talking about philosophy, now you're engaged with the use of reason, right? And so that's why philosophers deal in matters that any rational person could be persuaded of through the mere use of reason. and religion deals in revelatory texts and priestcraft and things like that. That is a modern invention. That divide simply isn't there in the ancient world. So when you're looking at people like Plato and Socrates, they say, for example, in the Phaedrus, when talking about the philosopher, they say, well, wise you may not call them, for that name belongs to one, and that one is God, who is wisdom. In other words, according to Plato and Socrates, the philosopher is one who loves God. And so for this reason, the atheist couldn't actually be a philosopher on this definition. Similarly, with Aristotle, when Aristotle finishes going through his explanation of what is metaphysics, and he talks about this exploration of causes, and then he works his way to a first cause, he comes to the conclusion that metaphysics is theology. That's how he defines it. And so within the ancient world, you don't have that strict divide. Also, in terms of the idea that the pagans didn't believe in revelation, well, that's true in some cases, right? Aristotle's unmoved mover doesn't speak to us or reveal himself or offer sacred texts or something like that. That's certainly true. But not all of the pagans believe that. The Stoics certainly believed in signs. They believed in oracles. So the idea that the Logos might speak or reveal something to you actually was part of Stoic ethics. Now, granted, of course, for the Jews and for the Christians, there is a collection of sacred writings from the prophets, from the apostles, obviously the revelation of the Logos in the incarnation, where the Logos himself walks among us. This is definitely unique. But to suggest that this divide is simply that one group believes in revelation and the other doesn't is an oversimplification. Also, the notion that one group relies on reason and the other on revelation, also a gross oversimplification. Clearly, Christianity continues to advocate for the idea that reason discerns true things about the world, that you are an icon of God. And the higher order, of your faculties, the spiritual side of yourself, reason is capable of looking out into the world because it's an icon of God and recognizing the structures that are there, right? It recognizes the handiwork of its archetype. So within Christianity, yes, reason can tell you true things about the world. Reason can help you understand and discern the proper order of nature, your place within the order of nature, and so on. But Christianity also acknowledges that, first of all, your reason is fallible. That is certainly one thing. So you can go wrong in your judgments and your discernment about the right course of action, for example, or certain things about the order of nature. It's a fallible guide when it comes to discerning the order of nature and the right way to live, right? The path to happiness. In addition, unlike in the pagans, where the order of nature simply is the way it is, in Christianity, there's the unique notion of the fall, the idea that something has gone wrong or corrupt. So it's not simply that reason is fallible, but it's that reason is up against the sorts of twistings and corruptions that have come into the world. And those are both extrinsic in terms of the demonic powers that try to lead you astray and tempt you and deceive you. And it's also internal in terms of things have gone wrong within our own hearts. And so in that sense, the idea that reason alone could somehow just be sort of a pure guide to the way we ought to go is problematic. And this is where divine revelation plays an important part in this. That divine revelation is part of the ways in which we hear, as it were, from our Creator. We hear, as it were, from the Logos about the way we ought to go, about the ways in which we have been corrupted, about the sort of misguided paths we might take, and we are directed and taught the right way to go. In addition to this, you also have within, of course, Christianity, the notion that because we are broken and we are corrupted and we are twisted, that there is also a need for some sort of healing. And this is where the sacraments come into play. So within Christianity, again, both East and West, the idea that somehow the path toward virtue could be done simply, out of natural capacities is something that's rejected. And again, the dynamics of what that means will play out, when we talk more, directly about East-West anthropology. But for now, suffice it to say that both the Christian East and the Christian West believe that given the fall and the twisting of the human person, there is a need for some mode of healing and restoration in order for humanity to become what we are made to be. And of course, the sacraments are part of that. The work of the Holy Spirit is part of that, right? Baptism, chrismation, the Eucharist, repentance, confession, the healing work of Christ is all required in order for us to really sort of become, right, attain, well, eudaimonia, if we're going to talk about this, right, to attain happiness, to attain well-being, to attain proper formation and things like that. It is a higher and loftier thing we are called to within the Christian vision of humanity than merely becoming a good, upright citizen who is, chaste and courageous or something like that. The goal of humanity, the end for which man is made, is something higher and loftier, having to do with communion with God and some form of, let's say, glorification within the Latin West or deification within the Christian East. So these would be a couple of the caveats where, while there's resonance with the idea of virtue being central to the human person, while there's resonance with the idea that natural law does exist, that there is a proper order of nature, while there's resonance with all of those aspects of pagan philosophy, there are two or three really critical differences, right? The critical difference that there has been a fall, so something's gone twisted and wrong and been corrupted within us. And so we don't have sort of at our disposal through mere natural powers the ability to really achieve the end that we are made for. For that reason, there is a need for grace and sacrament and this sort of divine aid. And then also with that, that there is a need for guidance from our Creator, provided in the form of revelation, to help us, guide us in the way that we ought to go. And of course, we need the incarnation, the work of Christ that actually heals our species and offers to us this sort of healing grace that comes to us through the sacraments. All that's true. And of course, in addition to this, because our God is not, in fact, just sort of an absentee deistic metaphysical principle, but one who is deeply concerned with us and is provident in a personal way, there is the addition of divine revelation by which we receive this guidance through prophets and apostles, and of course from the Logos himself, who took on flesh and dwelt among us. And that revelation serves as a guide to correct where our reason might go wrong. So those are some of the critical differences. Now, what are some of the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West? Again, I'm going to do a whole episode on this, but I'll just note a couple of the nuances that you begin to see here. First of all, if we're talking about virtue, I think it's fair to say that within the Latin West, there is a tendency more toward Aristotle. And so within the Latin West, with the tendency toward Aristotle, anybody who's familiar with medieval scholasticism, people like Thomas Aquinas, you're familiar with the fact that Aristotle was lost in the Latin West and then sort of rediscovered later in the medieval period and became really central to a lot of the theological and philosophical work being done amongst the Latin writers. And for that reason, a lot of their exploration of virtue ends up reflecting Aristotelian principles having to do with Aristotelian virtue ethics, the formation of virtuous habits, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the Christian East, there is perhaps a greater resonance with some of the more Stoic tendencies. So that's where you see a greater emphasis amongst the Christian East on the passions and on the cultivation of apatheia. I'd also say that over here in the Latin West, one of the things you see is this nature-grace divide, which I've talked about any number of times, but this is one of the reasons why within the Latin West there was a tendency to almost talk at times as if virtue had to do with a natural capacity, right? A certain formation of habit through a mere sort of exercise of reason and will. But grace was this other thing having to do with the underlying affections and being able to do things in a way that was pleasing to God and therefore meritorious. And so in some ways, the approach to virtue ended up sort of splitting it in a certain way between the natural capacity for virtue and the sort of supernatural capacity to accumulate merits before God. And this is actually one of the reasons why somebody like Luther has such contempt for Aristotelian philosophy, precisely because he thinks it, leads to a sort of sense that one might cultivate virtue apart from grace, right? A sort of false sense of righteousness or something like that. Whereas in the Christian East, one of the things that you begin to see is you don't have that nature-grace divide. Like, yes, you have a divide in the sense that grace is supernatural, but within the Christian East, grace refers primarily to the divine energies, right? It is God himself. Virtue in the Christian East is God himself. Christ is referred to, amongst the many things Christ is referred to as, by Gregory of Nyssa, for example, is referred to as virtue. And the connection between the creature and God actually is a natural connection. So while there is a distinction between the creature and God, the tether between the creature and God actually is a natural tether. And in this sense, me as an icon of God have a natural and unseverable connection with my archetype, with my divine archetype that gives me access to the divine energies. Of course, that's been twisted and it's been crippled in the fall, but it's still there. And I think that's one of the reasons, as we'll see when we talk about anthropology, there's more of a binary view about whether or not something has merit or demerit in the Latin West, whereas there's more of a spectrum within the Christian East. It's not simply that one is either Christian and their deeds are pleasing to God because they operate in grace, or they are not and everything is of necessity sin. There is more of a spectrum there. For reasons that we'll talk about. Now, again, these are nuances that we'll devote an entire episode to, but at least for now, suffice it to say that where there's agreement in the East and the West is the idea that being fallen creatures for whom something has gone wrong, there is a need for divine grace. We can't become the thing we are made to become just through natural efforts or just through, an exercise of habit or something like that. So that's basically where you begin to see the Christians enter into this discussion with that certain amount of resonance with the pagan philosophy, and yet some of these modifications that happen, right? These caveats that need to be added precisely because they are Christians. They are Christians who believe in a fall, because they are Christians who believe in an incarnation, because they're Christians who believe in sacraments, because they're Christians who believe in divine revelation that provides guidance. Now, there are differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. And, as I said, I'm going to do an entire episode on some of those sorts of nuances. But right here, I'll just sort of touch on some of those as a bit of a teaser of some of the things that will come out later in that deeper investigation. I'll say, for example, when it comes to natural law, there's a long natural law tradition within the Latin West, and this is largely traceable to Thomas Aquinas. And this is the roots of much of contemporary Roman Catholic ethical teaching. And the idea here, if you're familiar with this is where a lot of these sort of sexual ethics come from. So, for example, the Roman Catholic opposition to contraception, for example, it has a natural law basis where the insistence is, well, what is the reason or the purpose or the end of your sex organs? Well, it's for procreative purposes. And so therefore, when you utilize contraception, what's actually happening is that you are trying to, in some ways, harvest the pleasure that comes from the sexual organs while stopping the intended purpose of the sexual organ, which is procreation, and that's unethical. So ergo, via natural law, contraception is wrong. And then this also goes into other areas like, things like oral sex or whatever it might be. And so a lot of Catholic ethics are sort of known for this very sort of, curated natural law type thinking. And I think for a lot of folks within the Christian East, that's so alien to their ethics that there's a tendency for many to say, well, the Christian East doesn't believe in natural law. And that's actually not true. You can find plenty of instances within the Eastern Church Fathers where they talk about the order of nature, where they'll condemn certain, sort of acts or sins as unnatural, as violating the order of nature. So that's certainly there within their thinking. And they certainly are in the sense of realists, where they believe that moral right and wrong is rooted in some ways in the natural structure, the order of nature, the structure of things. And it's also tied clearly with teleology. Everything that they have to say about the fall, for example, is on the assumption that the higher and the lower nature have a proper order given the nature of what they are. The spirit being superior ontologically to the irrational animal nature is rightly the one that should be higher in the hierarchy and therefore lead and order the lower nature. And so the fall, which inverts this relationship, is an unnatural twisting. That's what it means to call it a corruption. So within the Eastern Fathers, within Eastern Christianity, you certainly do have a tether to natural law. What you don't have is the sort of systematizing that you oftentimes find in the Latin medieval scholastics and beyond within that tradition. And so I would say that that's not so much a difference in the sense of one believes in natural law and one doesn't. Both believe in natural law. It's just a difference in the sense that one within the Latin scholastic context has been developed and fleshed out in a way that is alien to what you find within the Eastern Church Fathers. So it's not as heavy of a reliance upon natural law as the sort of supreme guide for sort of wandering through moral matters. But there is a presumption that virtuous conduct and the commands of Scripture and the wisdom of the fathers and of the saints is in accord with the order of nature. And so that would really be the difference, not a difference in whether or not they believe in natural law. Similarly, with regard to virtue, they both believe in virtue. You find this across both traditions. But of course, if you're familiar with the Latin scholastic tradition, you're also familiar with the fact that Aristotle within the Latin West was lost for a period of time, and then he was rediscovered. And this is where Aristotelian philosophy becomes really critical in a lot of Latin scholastic thinking, philosophy, theology, and yes, in ethics. And so a lot of what is said about ethics ends up in the Latin West, ends up reflecting these sort of Aristotelian principles about the formation of virtue through habit, for example. Whereas within the Christian East, one of the things that you begin to see is you begin to see a greater resonance with things like Stoicism. Now, again, there is not necessarily a particular reference to the Stoics. You do find that, right? Basil of Caesarea jokes that he's oftentimes accused of being a good Stoic. But what you see is because their concern is primarily about the passions and the taming of the passions and the cultivation of apathy and things like that, that you see a certain resonance that looks a little more like what you might find in a Stoic than what you find in Aristotle. But both are aimed at a properly formed human being who has cultivated virtue. You also see certain differences here in terms of, the perspective on virtue that is reflective of the nature-grace divide. So I've talked about this in other contexts, the idea that within the Latin West, in the post-Augustinian era, there is what is called a nature-grace divide. And I'll talk about this at length when we get to the anthropology section for the episode that's specifically on anthropology. But the short version, of course, is that nature is not capable of sort of raising itself up and becoming pleasing to God on its own powers. And this is why there is a need for a supernatural effect, which we call grace, that enables the rational being to do things out of a pure love for God that is pleasing and meritorious before God. This is the medieval concept. Now, for that reason, one of the things that starts to emerge, as you see within a lot of the medieval scholastics, you see almost this dichotomy between like natural virtue and supernatural meritorious deeds, where there is almost this acknowledgement that you could form certain habits naturally that are positive good and we might call virtuous habits, but the underlying order of loves might still be disordered without the help of grace, and that's one of the reasons why there's a difference between sort of natural virtue and the sort of deeds done out of properly ordered loves that are pleasing to God. And this is one of the reasons actually why Martin Luther later has a great deal of contempt for Aristotelian philosophy, because he sees it as in some ways giving too much credit to the ability of man to be virtuous, right? Sort of cultivating this false righteousness. Now, contrast this with the Christian East, and this is where you begin to see First of all, there isn't a concept of virtue as being a purely natural capacity or something like that. Virtue is amongst the divine energies. And so one of the things that you see when you look at Gregory of Nyssa, for example, is you see that Christ himself is virtue, with a capital V, so to speak. And so virtue is actually cultivated through communion with God, or partaking of the divine nature. It is something that's inherently, divine in origin. And this also goes to the fact that within the Christian East, there isn't a nature-grace divide. The icon has a natural and inseverable connection with its divine archetype. And so while, yes, there is a difference between God and man, while there is a difference between the supernature of God, the divine energies, and man who partakes of those, the connection and access to that divine nature is natural. Now, of course, the fall twists that, it hinders it, it chokes it, right? But the connection there is natural. And for that reason, there is a little bit more of a spectrum within the Christian East into whether or not a person is sort of cooperating with God or not. And of course, this isn't to denigrate the role of the sacraments. And, truly there is a difference between, before and after baptism and whether or not you've been joined with Christ or not. But that's not to suggest that the creature is utterly cut off from God with no connection or ability to cooperate or resist God prior to any sort of sacramental participation in God. Again, those are nuances that we'll get into when we get to the anthropology episode. But suffice to say, those are some of the nuanced differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. But on the whole, what you see here is that there's a great deal of resonance with the pagan notions that there is such a thing as natural law, that there is such a thing as virtue that is central to the formation of man, that happiness is central to the pursuit of man, and that happiness ultimately does have to do with well-being or the proper formation of the person, eudaimonia. And yet, because the Christian East and the Christian West are both Christians, they also both affirm that something has gone wrong within the world. So this current state is not our natural state. It is a twisted or corrupted or fallen state. For that reason, there is a need for us to undergo healing, and that healing, of course, is enacted by the person of Christ, the Logos who took on flesh for our sake, and we enter into that and participate in that through the sacramental life of the church. And in addition to that, because we are fallible, because we are corrupt, and because God actually is a personal God who doesn't simply sort of create the world and let it run on its own, that God has provided prophets and apostles, and of course, his own Son, the Logos himself, to provide guidance for where we might go astray, that we are not simply left to the mere use of reason. Now, there are some innovations that begin not in modernity per se, but the seeds for those are planted within late medieval scholasticism in the Latin West. And this is, of course, the seeds of nominalism. So anyone who has listened to me, regularly has heard me talk about the most important question in the history of ideas, which is the question of realism. And so with realism, for the umpteenth time, right, realism recognizes that you and I and everybody else, we look out into the world and we begin to think in terms of structures, right? We think in terms of genera, we think in terms of species, common properties, rules of logic and math and things like that, laws. And part of the question is, the question of realism is, when we do that, is the mind observing things that are out there, that are in some ways real? Are the structures of reality in some ways real? Or is it that the world out there just sort of is matter in motion? It is not, in fact, structured and ordered the way we think of it, but the mind, needing to navigate all of this sort of stuff that's out there, invents mental fictions that it then imposes on the world out there in order to offer an organizational structure. So if you say that those structures, those rules, those genera, species, common properties, if you say those things that we observe are actually real, and the mind is abstracting those, it's observing something out there that is real, and it is abstracting structures that are actually part of the world, then you are a realist because you're saying they're real. Whereas if what you think is, well, no, those structures are not real, right? There's matter out there. Sure, matter is real. But the organizational divisions that we have, where we categorize things as, this and as that, and we sort of see similarities and we start to create groups and things like that, those are just mental inventions, fictions, names, Latin nomen, that we impose on the world in order to organize stuff that is not inherently organized. Then you're a nominalist, right? Suggesting that they are in some ways just names or mental fictions or inventions that we impose on the world. Now, folks who have listened to me and are familiar with the fruit of nominalism, are familiar with the ways in which nominalism plants the seeds for empiricism and then skepticism, and the way reason begins to unravel in the hands of the empiricists who follow in the sort of nominalist footsteps. You might think that clearly this must be some sort of anti-providentialist, anti-theistic, atheistic enterprise. And while it's true that the empiricists who end up going the route of skepticism and then atheism and things like that were indeed nominalists, nominalism doesn't actually emerge out of atheism or emerge as an anti-providentialist push. Quite the contrary, it emerges pietistically. So what often happens with realists, and specifically Christian realists, is that they will oftentimes talk about the limits of omnipotence. Now, that might sound strange, right? Because I thought omnipotence means that God can do anything, right? And so how do you talk about he can do anything but, right? How do you provide a caveat or a qualification to anything? Well, the answer is simply this, right? In order to say that God can do this thing, we need to first present a coherent thing, right? So if you raise the question of saying, for example, can God make a square that is not a square, right? Well, on the one hand, it sounds like I've said something meaningful, right? I've said a square, you know what that is. I've said not, you know what that is. I said square again. Okay, we understand what these words are. But the way we've put them together, we haven't actually said anything meaningful. This is sort of the square circle thing that I oftentimes talk about. Can God make a square circle? And I point out that, for the realists, the answer is no. Not because the square circle represents something that is just too difficult for the omnipotent God to bring about, but rather the sound that has escaped my mouth when saying square circle isn't meaningful. Because what I've essentially said is, can God make a two-dimensional geometric shape with a flowing circumference on which all points are an equal distance from a common century, but not all points are an equal distance from a common century because it has four sides that are of equal length? I mean, all of those words are meaningful taken in themselves, but strung together, it's just gobbledygook, right? It's replete with contradictions. And so I haven't actually said anything. And as C.S. Lewis points out, to put, to say God can in front of nonsense doesn't make it any less nonsense. And so Christians, being realists, historically speaking, had oftentimes talked about things that God can't do, right? The free will defense, which is, a common staple in Christian thinking. It was presumed that, of course, God can't make self-determining creatures and then determine for them what they are going to do. It was presumed that there are certain things that God can't do, like lie. Well, this is why, right? Because for God to lie is in some ways contradicts certain essential traits of the divine nature. And within the Arian Dispute, this is a place where we see the sort of confessional commitment amongst the early Christians to the idea of realism. Because Arius suggests that the Son of God is actually a creature. So at some point you had God the Father, and he's not yet the Father, and he decides that he wants to be a father, so he creates the Son, the second person of the Trinity. Now, the thing is, the pro-Nicenes had said, well, if he makes the Son of God, if he's a creature, then he has these innate creaturely traits, like he came to be. He didn't exist, and now he exists. If he came to be, that's a change, so he's a changeable being. He's mutable. Because he's mutable and changeable, he's also corruptible. He can change for worse, and so on. And they named all of these sort of entailments, metaphysical entailments, of being a creature. And Arius at some point pivots, and he tries to say, well, no, the Son of God is just like the Father. He's immutable, he's incorruptible, and so on. It's just that, God creates him that way. And what was interesting is in the dispute, basically what comes to the fore is that Arius is suggesting that God can create a second God. And the pro-Nicenes are saying that's impossible. Not even God can do that. Now, why? Because it's an inherent contradiction. God is not a creature. And so if this thing is a creature, it cannot be God, right? And that's the entire point. And so what you see is that realists oftentimes will say, like, God can't do in certain things, right? He can't lie. He can't create a second God. He can't make free creatures that aren't free. And they're comfortable talking that way, saying, yes, God can do anything, but you need to first present a coherent thing, something that's metaphysically possible. And nonsense is just nonsense. It's not metaphysically possible. It's not even a meaningful suggestion. But what you start to see is that certain figures in the late medieval scholastics grow uncomfortable with this way of doing metaphysics, uncomfortable with this way of talking about things that, God can and cannot do, certain metaphysical entailments that might in some ways tell us the sort of limitations of omnipotence. So figures like Ockham grow uncomfortable with the idea of saying God can't do that, right? He can't make free creatures that aren't free, for example. And what you begin to see is you begin to see the birth of nominalism, where the insistence is, look, these logical structures that we're referring to are really sort of created logical structures. These are the rules that we are accustomed to. These are the rules that apply within our created cosmos, but these are ordained rules, and there's no way of sort of projecting these backwards on God. And so for that reason, these are really just sort of mental inventions or mental fiction. They're sort of customary ways of thinking, right? Ways in which we think, but they don't have to do with rules of reality per se. And so for that reason, what you start to find with somebody like William of Ockham and with other nominalists is you find that they're okay sort of trying to deal with theological problems and say, well, of course God could do this, but he hasn't done that. So for example, with the nature-grace divide, William of Ockham wants to say, well, could God make a creature that could be pleasing to him without grace? And Ockham wants to say, yes, he could, but within our cosmos, he has not made the world that way. So creatures nature is inherently incomplete. It needs grace. And that's just the way God has ordained it, but he could have ordained it a different sort of way. And that tends to be the way in which Ockham thinks, right? He tends to say, like, well, of course God could, and fill in the blank. When it comes to inherent contradictions, seeming tensions that appear unresolvable, somebody like Ockham is okay with saying, well, yes, but sort of God is above those type of tensions. And so this is all sort of initially a very pietistic way of saying, like, let's not put limitations on God. And that's the original intent of it. And with that, what you start to get is you start to also get resistance to things like, in the ethical realm, natural law. Because natural law wants to say certain things like God can't make murder morally upright. He can't make rape morally upright. He can't make torturing infants morally upright. That there is something about the nature of these things per se that make them inherently wicked and evil, and not even God can make them otherwise, because they are simply repugnant to the order of nature and to the nature of things. But with someone like William of Ockham, there becomes a resistance to that, where it suggests, like, no, what makes something good or evil is simply that God has ordained that that is good and that is evil. And this is where you get the birth of divine command theory. And so divine command theory is really saying that what grounds the moral goodness of a thing is that God commanded that thing. What grounds the moral badness of a thing? It violates what God has commanded. So in this sense, what you end up with is the idea that there is no innate moral goodness or badness to creation per se, but rather these things superimpose upon the world. And there were different nuanced versions of this. John Duns Scotus tries to sort of thread the needle with this way of thinking, for example, and he wants to in some ways suggest that, yes, there is a rootedness in the divine command that sort of grounds the supervening property of moral uprightness, but he wants to suggest that there is a unity to God's wisdom such such that there still is a rationale for why he is commanded in this way. And this is actually a common thing that happens, I think, with a lot of nominalists, a lot of Christian nominalists anyway, where what they want to say is they want to, on the one hand, say that, yes, God could do anything, and they want to appeal to his power, but then they want to suggest that his wisdom or his goodness ends up requiring that he behave in this way. And so even though we're going to say that hypothetically God could do this, he never would, or something like that. I just have to say, for my part, I don't think that's actually coherent. I don't think it's coherent to say that the divine nature is of such a kind that God would never do that, and yet it is possible for God to do that. I don't think that's actually a coherent claim. But that is the sort of splitting that happens between divine power and divine wisdom oftentimes in these sort of attempts to introduce a sort of divine command theory without yielding to the ramification that God might command the torturing of infants for fun, and it would be good, because there's still this moral intuition that says that can't be right. I talked about in the second episode this divide that emerges in modernity between the empiricists on the one hand and the rationalists on the other. Now, the rationalists, they do have oftentimes a realist tendencies. People like Gottfried Leibniz, he definitely has a tendency toward, a form of Platonism. And so, to no surprise, a lot of these sort of modernist scholastics, and there are still those in theological circles, post-Reformation scholastics, continue to have a tendency toward natural law. Even certain forms of rationalism, like Leibniz, which is not a strictly speaking sort of classical metaphysics, still has this type of tendency toward the idea of an innate teleology that is in some ways tied with the good of the being and things like that. So you do still have amongst the rationalists, even though it's sort of like a neo-realism or something like that. Rationalism is not strictly speaking sort of like the older school metaphysics, but there is still a tendency towards some form of, a natural law way of thinking, a tendency toward virtue ethics way of thinking like that on the sort of rationalist side. But what that's competing with over here is the empiricist trajectory that is starting to merge. And the empiricist trajectory really is the child of nominalism. So you see this in certain empiricists like John Locke, right? John Locke is your quintessential empiricist who wants to suggest that the mind is a blank slate, and everything that we know and think about the world is based on impressions pressed in on this tabula rasa, right, this blank slate of the mind, and that comes in through your five senses. That's where your ideas come from. That's what all of your thinking is about. And the first step when establishing his empiricism, somebody like John Locke, actually is to introduce nominalism and defend it against innate ideas and attack Platonism, for example. So the empiricism that Locke is talking about here really is, at the end of the day, a certain form of nominalism. And this is true for the other sort of members of the mechanical philosophy, for example. I talked about this notion of the mechanical philosophy that emerged in modern philosophy. I talked about that in the second episode. And that really is a reiteration, a resuscitation, if you will, of the ancient atomism, right? The early mechanical philosophers like Pierre Gassendi and others had gone back to the anti-providentialists. They had gone back to the atomists of the ancient Greeks and said, well, maybe we can sort of dust this off and bring it back to life. Now, as I also noted, these were Christians, right? So much like William of Ockham. Even though they are sort of rejecting the traditional providentialist realism that's there, and they're embracing a philosophy that was inherently atheistic, or at least atheistic with an asterisk on it, in the ancient world, they were saying, well, maybe we can sort of bring this back to life. And we can pair it with divine providence. We can say that, well, yes, the atoms aren't just moving or coalescing randomly. They are moving and they're coalescing in accord with the sort of providential designs and decrees of God. So with this early empiricism, you do have this underlying nominalism there, which is suggesting that the ways that we think about the world, the sort of groups that we create, really are sort of mental structures and so on. However, because it's being paired with a certain type of providentialism, God is the one who's ordaining the structures, the arrangements of atoms, and these sorts of things, there's still an attempt to somehow wed a certain form of natural law with this nominalism. And now that might sound like an awkward pairing, and indeed it actually is. And this goes to the sort of thing that I've talked about with Lockean natural law in the past. So John Locke is somebody who is, on the one hand, an empiricist and a nominalist, and yet he wants to suggest that he is an advocate of natural law. Now, how can you do this? Because, as we've said, what natural law is all about is the idea that there are innate forms or natures or essences of things, and then those forms or essences carry with them an innate teleology, a purpose or an end. And that connection between the form and the end of the thing, the formal cause and the final cause of the thing, is the thing that tells you the proper place for it in the order of nature and so on. So if you've gotten rid of form, if you've gotten rid of innate teleology, right? There is no sort of innate form that entails a certain proper end or function, and you just sort of have an imposed or an extrinsic teleology. You just have that God has decided to order the atoms in a certain way. How is it that you could possibly talk about natural law? And this is where what Locke advocates is, as I said, it's not classical natural law. It's not the natural law of the Stoics or of the Eastern Fathers or somebody like Thomas Aquinas. It's a form of consequentialism. And this is where the consequentialism is really the type of thing that I've said that isn't really natural law in the true sense, but is the sort of thing that maybe mom and pop might offer, which is, look, if you engage in a certain, mode of conduct, there might be certain consequences that result from that you find unpleasant. And that unpleasantness tells you that that's not a good way of operating within the world. And that really is sort of the new form of natural law that begins to emerge with Locke. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that empiricism, because of its innate nominalism, has trouble holding, the reins on this form of natural law. And it naturally sort of slides down into a form of hedonism or utilitarianism or eventually things like ethical egoism. And why is that, right? Well, the reason is, as I had pointed out, that in later empiricists, or, not so late, we don't have to fast forward very far, but in people like David Hume, you're going to start to find people who are advocating and saying, yes, empiricism is the way to go. That's the true philosophy. We should absolutely be empiricists. But because we're empiricists, we should be skeptics. And this is the thing that I had talked about how certain things that we encounter in reality, like causality, like the enduring subject, these things are actually immune to empirical verification, right? John Locke, when he's talking about the substance, right, of the individual that's beneath the various sensation, he says, well, substance is I know not what. Well, why does he know not what? Well, because he's an empiricist and he can't sort of dig beneath it. So if you're a metaphysician who believes that there are non-empirical realities, you can have something like talking about the enduring subject beneath the sensations. But if you're an empiricist, a through and through empiricist who only believes that which is empirically accessible is real, then you can't have things like that. Causality becomes a problem too, because causality, you observe one thing happening and another thing following, but the actual transference is something you don't observe, empirically speaking. And this is where I use always the example of Foley artists, where you see someone knock on a door in a movie and you hear a knock and you naturally tie those two things together and you presume that that moving hand is the cause of that sound you heard. But a Foley artist has removed the sound recorded on set and replaced it with something else that's not causally related at all. And yet your observation leads you to believe that there's a causal relationship, but there's not. And so this is why somebody like David Hume suggests that you should be very skeptical, because we have all sorts of ideas in our minds that are non-empirical. And so if we're really empiricists, we should be skeptical of those sorts of things. Well, one of those is morality. And the reason is because when we're talking about these things like good and evil, right and wrong, well, what is the empirical content of that? Hume thinks that there's always a leap in logic, right? This guy went and he stabbed that woman over there, and that's wrong. And Hume thinks, well, there's nothing in the initial statements that you said about the empirical realities, him having a knife going, putting it into her, that tells me this thing that it is wrong, right? There's a leap there, just like there's a leap in causality. Of course, you could look at this and say, well, that tells me that there's something wrong with empiricism. Or, alternatively, you could do what many empiricists did, which is you say, well, what are the empirical facts that we can cling on to? And this is where you have a natural movement toward a form of hedonism. And this is, once again, the sort of thing we saw in the Epicureans, where the idea is that because the empirical content is pleasure and pain, that somehow what we want to say is that things are pleasant and unpleasant for us. And when we say that this is good or this is bad, that's really what we're talking about. Now, in this sense, what begins to emerge is a form of utilitarianism. The idea that an act is deemed good or bad based on its utility or usefulness for bringing about a pleasant state of affairs, right? And so here we still have the aim of happiness. Here we still have the idea that a person wants to have a certain general well-being. And here we are judging acts by how much they move us toward that well-being. But all of these terms have taken on a different meaning. The well-being of the individual has to do with a generally pleasant state of affairs. The good of a thing has to do with its ability to produce pleasure, and its utility has to do with its usefulness for moving me toward a state of affairs that I find generally pleasant and relatively void of pain, right? So this is where we now have a form of utilitarianism, which itself is a type of consequentialism. The question would be whether or not something like utilitarianism is inherently at odds with John Locke's form of consequentialism, which he labels natural law. And I think the answer is it depends on the form of utilitarianism. Because one of the natural questions for the utilitarian is, well, when we talk about its usefulness for happiness, are we talking about the broader social happiness? And it doesn't matter, I am to sort of sacrifice my own happiness to the sort of good of the whole, the happiness of the whole? Or are we just talking on a private, individual level, that it only really matters whether or not it brings me happiness? Now, of course, in a lot of these discussions, the tendency is that your moral intuitions kick in and you think, well, I shouldn't be selfish, right? But one of the questions you face is, well, why not, right? Once you've gotten rid of these sort of objective values and you've gotten rid of the entire idea of some sort of order of nature that is in some ways an objective metric of my own personal values, and you're really measuring things on the basis of my own personal happiness, now it's really a dispute between objective and subjective values. Now, what I really mean here is this. John Locke is in some ways, as somebody who does believe in God, he's still trying to hold on to the idea that there are sort of normative principles, right? He wants to say that, well, even though there is no sort of innate structure to the human person, God has still decided to order matter in a certain relatively consistent way. And for that reason, that relative consistency gives rise to relatively consistent rules. And those relatively consistent rules are reflective of a certain way in which God wants us to be in the world. And so somebody like Locke wants to say, well, there's a consequentialism here, but there's still a sense in which there are consistent rules that apply to everybody. And he can use the sort of God principle there in order to try to ground that in some way. But once you're a utilitarian who has either bracketed the question of God or who has rejected the existence of God, as many of the later utilitarians did, then you run into this issue of saying, well, is there a universal ethic that can be had? Because at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is, Aristotle acknowledged this himself, right? Aristotle tells us that some people sort of are bent this way, and I'm bent this way, and you're bent that way. And if what we don't have is actually a definitive objective order of nature, there's no sort of form of man that tells us the proper way in which any human being ought to be, but we all have just idiosyncratic formation, then you're really sort of left with the question of saying, well, is there actually a universal ethic? Or is it that I individually enjoy certain things that you don't enjoy? And now with morality reduced to essentially a form of hedonism, where the question is what brings me happiness, by which I mean a certain degree of pleasure, well, it may well be that there are certain things that under a classic morality would be deemed immoral, but I can engage in, and in engaging in those things, my happiness is elevated. And so in this sense, they're very useful for bringing me to a generally pleasant state of affairs, a state of affairs that I enjoy. And this is where utilitarianism then begins to fall into really the no harm principle, where the point is, well, the only restriction is that I shouldn't be able to do harm to others, right? And so in terms of elevating happiness, and now, of course, becomes that tension between the broader society and the individual. But under most sort of utilitarian approaches that want to introduce a no harm principle, they want to say, well, I can engage in idiosyncratic behavior that perhaps you, under a classical sort of Christian morality, would deem immoral, but as long as it elevates my happiness and I can engage in a way that doesn't do harm to my neighbor in any sort of direct way, then in this sense, it would be morally upright. And so under the utilitarian principle, now what begins to happen is the obliteration of the objective moral norms for something that is highly subjective. And then you have other forms of basically consequentialism that begin to emerge, right? One of these is, for example, ethical egoism. So fans of Ayn Rand would be familiar with this, right? Where ethical egoism ultimately suggests that I should operate in accord with my own best interests. And this is one of the ways in which free markets are oftentimes justified. The idea that markets that are free, even when people engage in their own self-interest, it's actually in my self-interest to be an honest dealer and things like that, to reward my employees well and keep them happier than my competition, who they might go over to them, and so on. And so a lot of sort of libertarian and sort of economic thinking about free markets is oftentimes sort of justified through ethical egoism. But on the private level, ethical egoism really does say the same sort of thing. It wants to say that I should be interested in a life that involves some sort of thriving, and so for that reason, I should operate in accord with my own self-interest in mind, and this is what drives me toward the right course of action. Now, one of the things you might anticipate is that with utilitarianism and with ethical egoism, with all of these forms of consequentialism, there are always very real questions of what do these terms mean? And this is something that's similar to the type of critique that I've oftentimes leveled in reference to counseling, right? A lot of counseling culture or therapy culture has a tendency to talk about healthy and unhealthy behavior. But at the same time, a lot of therapy culture wants to say that it's not moving into the area of worldview, it's not making any metaphysical assessment. It wants to present itself as scientific and clinical, as oftentimes, truly, utilitarianism wanted to do as well. But one of the challenges you have is that a term like healthy or unhealthy actually does presume some sort of objective content. To say that this is healthy, this organ, for example, is healthy, is to say that it has been properly formed. To say that this is an unhealthy behavior is to say that it is in some ways divergent from proper formation. And so the problem is you've moved into metaphysical territory. And the natural question is, on what authority, on what basis, how do you determine what constitutes the proper formation of the thing, and whether or not this type of behavior, this mode of behavior, is in keeping with the proper formation of the thing, and this one is divergent. And you run into this same thing with things like ethical egoism, for example. If you're going to talk about things that are, in your own best interest, well, part of the question is, what do you mean by my best interest? And oftentimes these sort of nominalist systems of thought, what they run into is an odd tension where they want to use objective language from realism. They want to say what is in my best interest, what leads to a thriving or a flourishing life. But those aren't neutral terms, right? They actually do suggest that there are certain modes of being that are in some ways more in keeping with what it means to be human, with my place in the world, and so on. Yet, if you are a nominalist, if you are an empiricist, and if you are, in keeping with so many of these systems, an atheist, then what on earth do these things refer to? There is no order of nature that you can refer to that says that this is aligned with the way things ought to be, and this is divergent from. And so you really are sort of always thrust back to the subjective sense of what I either personally value, and so in this sense, I value these things, and so a life that reflects these values is in some ways better or sort of in my self-assigned self-interest, or you have to go with some sort of empirical metric like pleasure and pain. And this is the sort of thing that the utilitarians tried to do in order to actually offer some sort of grounding for the claims being made. But of course, the problem is that the metric of pleasure and pain is you end up in a place where there is no objective morality anymore. There is only the fact that this ends up impacting me in a certain way that I find enjoyable or not. And so, you do run into this problem that if you go back to certain examples, like I used when I was talking about the Epicureans, and I talked about the fact that, if you look at, torturing infants for fun and you're like, well, that seems to be objectively wrong, right? There's something I don't care if you get any pleasure out of it. It's just wrong. This becomes a little dicier for somebody who is a strict nominalist, empiricist, atheist, consequentialist to actually say, because you're sort of stuck with the problem of saying, well, but if I get pleasure out of it, if I am actually somebody who is of such a kind that I enjoy torturing infants, then, what does it matter to me if the infant is actually experiencing pain? Now, the way, of course, you try to deal with this within this type of system is that you have a couple of ways of approaching it. You can say that, well, no, the good and the bad is determined on the basis of the overall happiness of the world. Now, that's always a difficult principle to introduce because the question is like, why, right? We don't actually have cosmic oughts having to do with the order of nature, so why should I be concerned about another person's happiness? And selling the sort of broad utilitarian vision becomes a little more difficult. And this is where what you have to get into really is sort of forethought, where you have to suggest something like a social contract theory, where you're like, look, here's the thing, and this is kind of a Hobbesian approach to sort of social ethics, where, the state of nature, where we're at war and we're at conflict, and you might steal my stuff, you might rape my wife, you might do this, you might do that, right? That's a state of nature. None of us wants to live in the post-apocalyptic Walking Dead scenario. We might enjoy it for like a day, right? Or two, maybe even a week. But at some point, you're like, can we have civilization back? It's too maddening to live with, perpetually looking over your shoulders. And so social contract, according to Thomas Hobbes, is where basically we call a truce. And the idea is that I won't trample on your flowers if you don't trample on mine. I won't rape your wife if you don't rape mine, and so on. And in addition to that, of course, what we need is we also need a very scary, very powerful sovereign who is there threatening us if, of course, we break the contract. And so that's Hobbes's political philosophy. Now, the way in which this begins to offer some sort of answer for the consequentialists is now the consequentialist can say, well, projecting ahead, here's the thing. I know that if I begin to disregard the pain of others and I start to just abduct people and torture them in my basement and things like that, even if I don't get caught, the problem is I'm sort of setting the precedent for a certain mode of being within the broader culture that if tolerated, if normalized, if perpetuated, could reverberate back and affect me. And so there's sort of an educated foresight where my hedonism has to consider the larger long-term consequences on society and things like that. And this is one of the ways in which consequentialists are able to talk about sort of broader social norms that you would want to endorse and avoid these sort of monstrous scenarios. And of course, there's a sense in which, that plays to an extent in a certain academic discussion. But the thing that it always seems to run up against is, well, your moral intuitions. So I'll give you an example. I used to, every now and then in ethics class, I would show, what is it called? High Crimes and Misdemeanors, I think or Small Crimes and Misdemeanors. What's the title? Anyway, it's a Woody Allen film. If you haven't seen it, you can go ahead and watch it. Spoilers ahead, but it's so old, I don't feel bad. about offering these. But basically what you have is you have this scenario where you have this guy who he's been having a long-term affair. He's cheating on his wife, and his mistress is finally like, I've had enough. I want you to leave her and be with me. And he's like, no, I can't do that. That would turn my life upside down. And she's like, I'm going to tell your wife, right? I'm going to tell her what's been going on. And he's like, no, what do I do? And he realizes his life is about to be turned upside down if this comes out. And so he goes to his close mafia friend, and he's like, man, what am I going to do? And he's like, don't worry about it. And of course, the wink, wink, nod, nod, don't worry about it is that we're going to go ahead and we're going to kill this lady. And so they make it look like a break-in, right? You know, somebody breaks into their house, she's killed in the process, there's some sort of struggle, and this guy is paranoid. He's nervous, he's anxious. You know, oh man, is he going to get caught? Are they going to find out? Are they going to trace it back to him? And basically, as things play out, what becomes really apparent is that this lady doesn't have any family. There's nobody grieving her, nobody mourning her, nobody wondering what happened. And as far as the cops are concerned, it's a cold case. And basically what you see is, from a utilitarian perspective, everyone's happiness increased. The mob already has a numbed conscience. They're not, up at night fretting about what they did. This guy now owes them a favor. They're happy with that. As far as he's concerned, his marriage got better, at the end of the movie, because he's no longer cheating on his wife, and he realizes, what good things he had. And in terms of this gal that's dead, well, if you don't believe in the afterlife, well, she's just dead, right? So her misery has actually been, ended. And so actually that sort of blot on the world has been diminished. And so all in all, this seems to be a good thing. And the problem is, and this is the sort of really genius part of that film, the problem is if you look at that and you get to the end and there is an accounting of what's happened, and you realize, well, according to the utilitarian, this would be a good thing, right? The world is better off now. But your moral instincts say that can't be right, right? Something in you says, I don't care if everybody can sleep fine at night. I don't care if everybody is quote unquote happier as a result. That was wrong, right? And that is the thing that always utilitarianism runs into. It runs into your moral intuitions, where the consequentialism is trying to offer some sort of accounting for how this makes a sort of valid way of approaching ethics, and could offer some sort of ethical guidance in terms of navigating right and wrong. But the problem is there are certain scenarios that on this form of ethical thinking, you would inevitably have to say are good, are upright, and yet they violate your moral intuitions. And this goes to something that I think is very important about ethics generally. And in ethics generally, one of the things I don't think a lot of people recognize is that the area of moral philosophy and ethics really is an exercise in reverse engineering. So when you go into a discussion about ethics, it's very important that I and you and everybody else involved just presume that we have moral faculties. Because if you don't have those, if you have no capacity to detect right and wrong, we can't actually engage in ethical discourse. So the thing is that this discipline recognizes that you and I and everybody else have intuitions that tell us that certain things about the world are right and wrong. And then when we delve into that, part of the question is, well, what is that all about? What do those words refer to? What are the structures of those things? And it ultimately becomes a type of reverse engineering, where you're saying, well, maybe it has to do with the order of nature. Okay. And then you're sort of pressing that theory and saying, well, does that belief, the order of nature, square with our moral intuitions? Let's run that model and see if it aligns with what we tend to intuit about the world. Maybe when we say good and evil, right and wrong, what we mean is we mean something like pleasure and pain. Does that work? That gives us a form of consequentialism or utilitarianism. Let's run that model. Does that work? Or do we end up with odd results like, high crimes and misdemeanors, where all of a sudden something that is obviously wrong is deemed good, and that becomes an indictment of the system? That's actually how the field of ethics really does work, right? It presumes that you and I have moral intuitions so that we can run these scenarios. And then in running these scenarios, our moral intuitions tell us whether or not the results make sense or whether it's an indictment of the system. So it's a very strange thing, right? Very strange thing is the fact that we just already have these intuitions. And part of the question is we're trying to understand what it is that we are intuiting. Naturally, you might say, well, what's the problem? Why do we even need to engage in moral philosophy or metaethics or any of this stuff if we already intuit what is right and wrong? And that's a great question. And this goes into an area that I already touched on, and I think this is rather important. And this is the area of when I talked about virtue epistemology. So the challenge is that, yes, we have a certain natural and innate ability to discern right and wrong, good and evil. We have conscience, which tells us that certain things are wrong and certain things are good and right and virtuous and praiseworthy, right? We have those intuitions. Storytelling depends on that. The rearing of children depends on that. Everything about the justice system and fairness depends on that. So if we have that, why do we need to engage in a discipline of trying to discern the structures and the order of morality? And the reason is, at least in part, the reason is exactly what I talked about with virtue epistemology. The fact that even though you have the ability to discern something about musicality, that ability to discern and see musicality is something that grows as you grow musically. That your ability to see beauty in art is something that is there, it's real, it's innate in you as a human being, but it's also something that can grow. And your clarity of vision with regard to the beauty of art can grow as you grow artistically. And so it is when it comes to morality, that as we engage and grow morally, we begin to see the moral world with greater clarity. And so this is really an exercise in epistemology. If at the end of the day we are atheists and anti-providentialists, then maybe that means nothing. Right? Maybe this is sort of just an odd evolutionary artifact that we have this thing that we call conscience. And maybe at the end of the day, good and evil, right and wrong is just pleasure and pain. And we really should just sort of engage in whatever sort of gives us a generally pleasant state of existence, mode of existence, buying our time in a relatively undramatic and enjoyable life until we're returned to the ground. Maybe that's reality. However, if the providentialists are correct, and there is a proper order of nature, then all of a sudden we have a different path laid out before us. And now we have to engage in these sorts of questions of saying, well, what is the nature of man? Okay, what is the nature of virtue? How is it that we are supposed to move forward and grow in virtue and so on? And in this sense, the examination of both metaphysics, the nature of the world, the examination of man, the examination of virtue, the examination of the order of nature, all of these things become integral to understanding and discerning what the good life is. And this is something that I've come back to again and again, which is to say that philosophy in the ancient world was not merely an exercise in just sort of, well, let's ask some interesting questions and play around with some answers while we drink some beers, right? Like, that was not what it was about. It was aimed at the very same thing that religion is aimed, which is answering the question of what is the good life? How is it that I am supposed to live? Trying to understand my place within this world and know, given what I am and given the nature of the world, how it is that I ought to live. And so this is one of the tools, right? This sort of self-examination, this examination of the world, this examination of virtue, of right and wrong, and all of these things is part of the effort to understand what is this very integral part of me that it's called morality. All of us have this conscience, right? All of us have this felt mandate to operate morally. So what is that? And in asking that question and digging down into the answer to that question, we begin to discern the path that's laid out before us. Now, of course, if we also add to this the possibility that the Christians are correct, then we also have other things that we have to consider, like whether or not we are actually in an appropriate and natural state of nature, or whether or not we're corrupt, whether or not the providential order of the cosmos has actually revealed himself and offered guidance, and most importantly, whether or not the Logos himself has become incarnate for us and for our salvation. And if so, then the answer to the question, how ought we to live, becomes very, very different. I'll leave it there for today. And next time, what we'll do is we'll begin to look at some contemporary issues of ethics and morality, common discussion points, and how these various ways of looking at the world and at moral philosophy ultimately inform how somebody might address or approach or think about those common moral disputes within our culture. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm. And also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.